Everyone, and welcome to 4.1.5 for the Legal Studies Guy. So whipping our way through area of study 1, halfway through here, but there are some dense dot points coming up, so potentially some slightly longer videos, particularly when we get into the second half of this area. I got a quote from William B. Sprague today. No idea who he is or why he has a famous quote, but I don't mind this one. Do not wait to strike till the iron is hot, but make it hot by striking. So who would have thought, going to continue on that theme of, don't sit around waiting to be motivated because you will just spend your whole life waiting. Motivation comes when you actually start, actually do something, pick something to do, get up and get started, even if it's not with your study, with anything in life. And once you get going, the momentum, that's when the motivation will come. Don't wait for it, or else, as I said, you'll sit around spending your whole life waiting. So we're up to 4.1.5, and today we're looking at factors that affect the ability of Parliament to make law. So we've talked leading into this a little bit about the structure of Parliament, the different houses of Parliament. We've looked at the different responsibilities of different parliaments, state versus Commonwealth. And now we're going to actually get into the nuts and bolts of law making. So when Parliament is changing the law, when Parliament is making laws, what sort of things do they have to consider? What sort of things will impact their ability to actually change the law? We're going to look at three specific things. So bicameral structure, international pressures, and the representative nature. So these are listed in the study design, which means you can be asked a direct question about any of these three. So you could be asked on an exam to discuss effectively how much the bicameral structure of Parliament affects its ability to make law, for example, or you could be asked more broadly what factors affect the ability of Parliament to make law. And as I just highlighted there, talking about that first one, our key skill here is discussion. So we need to have a multifaceted view of this. We need to both understand fundamentally how these things have an impact on Parliament, why Parliament is beholden to these factors, but also, ways Parliament has around them, how these things don't impact Parliament. So that two-sided look at, whether Parliament can change the law or not. Ultimately, at the end of this video, you are going to be able to say or explain to someone the factors that affect Parliament's ability to make law. And if someone says to you, hey, why can't Parliament just do that? You'll be able to run through the reasons that might be stopping them. It's really important that I start with this point. So this point will come up again in dot point 4.1.10 when we talk about the relationship between Parliament and the courts. But a fundamental factor that's going to affect Parliament's ability to make law is the fact that Parliament is supreme, or the supremacy of Parliament. So we refer to Parliament as the supreme lawmaking body. If an area is within its lawmaking power, so when we talk about lawmaking powers, remember we're talking about that division that we've talked about before and looked at. So, can draw my Venn diagram up here. And we've got residual, so state lawmaking powers on this side, exclusive on this side, and concurrent, obviously, in the middle. So provided something is within the lawmaking responsibility of Parliament, so say education over here for the states, or defence over here federally, or tax or something in the middle, provided it's within Parliament's lawmaking powers, Parliament has the ability, it's a really important point, to pass any law they want. So when we're talking about the ability of Parliament to make law, I think this pretty much in any question you get asked, this should almost always be your opening point. Well, of course, Parliament has the ability to make law because they're the supreme lawmaking body. Provided an area of law is within their jurisdiction, within their lawmaking powers, Parliament can pass any law they want. Therefore, Parliament always has the ability to make law. However, and this is the things we're going to start unpacking, even though Parliament might have the ability, and ability is perhaps a poor word, to have used in the study design. Even though Parliament might always have the ability as the supreme lawmaking power, they don't always have the will or the desire. Okay? And that's the stuff we're going to be unpacking today. These factors that influence whether Parliament actually wants to change the law or not. Because they might have the ability to, they might be the supreme lawmaking body, but they're not just going to change the law every single time they're asked or whenever they want, because there are lots of factors that are going to influence them. The first one of these is the bicameral structure of Parliament. So a reminder that bicameral means a Parliament with two houses, and for both our state and our federal Parliament, we have a lower house and an upper house. So for each of these, I'm going to talk about what it is, and then talk about how it impacts Parliament's ability to change the law. So bicameral, Parliament with two houses, upper and lower, House of Reps federally, Legislative Assembly, Legislative Council, Victoria. Okay, really consistent between those two things. We don't need to, overcomplicate this part of it. An important thing that we haven't noted before, though, is how you get elected to each house is different. So each house has a different voting method. And I've explained to you before, but if I draw up Australia here, and never forget Tassie, and let's just look at Victoria as an example. For the House of Representatives, and it's a similar concept at a state level, but I'll use the federal example. For the House of Representatives, we know Victoria is split into these large regions, and then as we get nearer to the city, the regions get smaller and smaller. And we elect one person from each, I'm writing little ones in there, one person from each of these areas to represent that region, that electorate, that area. That means effectively, if you're from a major political party, there's a really strong chance you're going to get elected from each area, because all you need to do is beat the other people. You just need to ultimately, through preferential system, end up with 50% of the vote. Which 50% is quite a high threshold, obviously. Trying to get 50% of the vote is, can be challenging. You've got to get ultimately half the people in the area that you live to either think you're the best person or realistically think you're the least worst, not put you at the bottom. Because in case you don't know, you'll have a list of candidates and you have to number your candidates from 1 through until 4. And obviously, the people with the least number of ones get eliminated, and so on and so forth, and their votes go to then the second person that they put on, until we get someone who has that 50% of the vote. So that's called preferential voting. And again, getting 50% of the vote, so being either the most liked or the least hated in your electorate, is a quite high threshold. And as a result, generally, in different electorates, we elect people from the major political parties. And that's why currently the Labor Party hold, and I'm going to be at risk of forgetting the correct number, 78 of the seats out of the 151, because it's skewed towards helping the major parties. If I then look at the Senate, and I'll draw South Australia here, well, at a regular election, we're just picking 6 people from the entirety of South Australia. And what that means is if we're only picking 6 people from the entirety of the vote in South Australia, everyone in South Australia is voting for this, who they want. You only actually need, and this is, maybe a difficult mathematical concept to understand, but it's worthwhile just putting forward. For the Senate, you only need to get 12 points. I've got to remember my actual numbers here. It's about 12.86% of the vote. Okay, and obviously, please correct me if I'm wrong. I do make errors quite often. 12.86% of the vote is very different to trying to get 50% of the vote. And what ends up happening is, in the Senate, it means we get a large number of, or a larger number of people from small political parties. a larger number of people from perhaps who are independent, who are or are from fringe political groups. Years ago when we had a what's called a double dissolution election, where we had 12 people voted in from each state, a guy got voted in Victoria from what's called the Australian Motoring Enthusiasts Party. His name was Ricky Muir. He was unemployed at the time. He didn't even really know that he was a chance of getting elected. But it's because that threshold in the Senate and the Legislative Council is that little bit lower. You only need 12.86% of the vote, which means, and that's it, sorry, for the Senate, which means you're more likely to get elected, which means the major parties don't win as many seats. What that means is, and we start talking about how it impacts the ability of Parliament to make law, what that means is one party rarely achieves a majority in both houses. So one party rarely has more than half the seats in both houses, which means the Senate can play its role as being a house of review. Okay? And because every single law has to pass through both houses, the Senate not having a majority from a major political party actually means bills have to be properly debated. So as we talk about here, the proportional voting, it's called proportional voting, it provides greater opportunities for minor parties to be elected. This increases the range of community viewpoints, which makes it harder to pass laws. Legislation has to be considered, debated, and agreed upon from multiple viewpoints. One party can't abuse their lawmaking power. So how does the bicameral structure affect Parliament's ability to make law? Well, it means laws and any law change has to be debated. Any law change has to be scrutinised from multiple viewpoints, and one political party can't just pass whatever law they want. Now, to look at this, in practice, this was a question from last year's exam, and this really, really clearly illustrates what we mean by bicameral structure and not having a majority in both houses. So the question clearly states, the party with the majority of seats in the House of Reps is the Australian Labor Party. So majority meaning we know half plus one or more than half. And voting in Parliament happens on a simple majority. So if the Australian Labor Party have more than half the seats in the House of Reps, they can vote through whatever they want from the House of Reps. But then we look at the Senate, and we should know, hopefully, that the Senate has 76 total seats. If we look at the Senate, we can see that the Australian Labor Party only has 26. And these are important numbers to remember. Half plus one, a majority of 76 is 39. So the Australian Labor Party is actually a long way from 39. To be able to pass something, they need an extra 13 votes. So where are they going to get these 13 votes from? Well, they have to get them either from the Liberal National Coalition, maybe from the Greens. If they get the Greens, they still need these independents or the Jackie Lambie network, so on and so forth. So how does this affect the ability of Parliament to make laws? Well, it means laws have to be debated and scrutinised. The Labor Party, if they want to pass something from the House of Reps through the Senate, means they have to get people that aren't their own political party to agree with them, therefore affecting their ability to change the law or affecting Parliament's ability to change the law. And that's ultimately that main role of the Senate, right, that we talk about, is the Senate is a house of review. It scrutinises the work of the lower house. It scrutinises the government and makes sure the government can't do what it wants. It is worth noting that 2 times in Australian history, so twice in Australian history, we have had a political party achieve a majority in both houses. So it has happened twice, but it's extremely rare. The last time was 2004, and that political party got destroyed at the next election 3 years later because they started just doing whatever they wanted, and they passed some really unpopular laws. And 3 years later, when an election rolled around, the public booted them out dramatically. John Howard actually lost his own individual electorate. He got voted out of his own seat, and he was the Prime Minister. So after the election, he wasn't Prime Minister anymore because his party lost, but he also lost the seat that he sat in. So really, really important that we understand, the different roles of the houses and then how that impacts lawmaking based on particularly the number of seats in each house. The most straightforward of these three things is this second one, the representative nature of Parliament. And this is the idea that Parliament is filled with people who are elected. You know, we have an election every 3 years federally, 4 years state. And ultimately, Parliament is beholden to the people. So we're a representative democracy. Electorates are equally populated, as we know, so everyone's vote carries equal weight. Ultimately, really, really straightforward, this one. If Parliament does something that you don't like, or if Parliament repeatedly does something you don't like, you vote for someone else. So if your representative from your local area continues to act or vote in a way that you don't agree with, you know, the political party that they're from, for example, continues to vote on things that aren't aligned with your viewpoints and your values, then you vote for someone else. What does this mean? Well, it means laws have to be in line with the needs of the community. If they're not in line with the needs of the community, you will vote for someone else at the next election. Ultimately, politicians are doing a job. You know, we hope politicians want to become parliamentarians because they believe in the greater good, right? And they love their communities and they want to do best for the people in their community. And I would say for a lot of politicians, this is true. But it is fundamentally a job. And as a job, politicians have to be wary of not losing it. If someone else gets elected in their area, if the people that they're representing vote for someone else, the politician loses their job, they lose their income. So realistically, they should be accountable for the decisions that they make. So how does it affect the ability of Parliament to make law? Well, we can vote someone else in if they don't follow our wishes, and it means any laws should be in line with public interest. Finally, we have international pressures. Now, this is a new addition to the study design, so it's bound, until we get a good exam question on it, bound to be some conjecture or debate about exactly how this dot point is intended to be assessed, but we'll have our best crack at it here. So, what are international pressures? So I'm going to highlight two types of international pressure here, okay? So we're going to call this one type 1, and I've got 2 example questions that help illustrate these 2 types. So really simply, as well as pressure from voters, which is also a little bit of type 2, politicians have international pressures they need to address. And these can be type 1. So type 1 is what I refer to as global pressures. So pressures from external to Australia, so from outside the country, and I'll talk about what they might be shortly. And this is where people from outside the country or organisations outside the country, so global pressures, try and force Australia or Victoria to change a law regarding a domestic issue. This is as opposed to international pressure type 2, which is a internal domestic political pressure, so things like protests, petitions, demonstrations, media, etc., that are trying to change the law, still trying to change domestic laws, but in response to some kind of global issue that's occurring. I've italicized global both times, global issue and global pressure, because the key thing is if you're talking about international pressures, you want to focus on the international aspect of it. If you're talking about, so a great example of this second one, which I'll talk about in a moment, would be climate change. Climate change is a global issue. It's an issue affecting everyone. There's a lot of global pressure regarding climate change as well, you know, different conferences and treaties and things like that Australia is part of. But we also know that there's a lot of domestic political pressure to change the law in response to climate change. So to change Australia's laws in response to this global issue. And a lot of that domestic pressure comes from, and I'll talk about this is type 2 down here. A lot of this domestic pressure comes from things like protests, petitions, use of the media. And if you think about climate change, you think about school strikes for climate change, for example. So groups of students taking a day off school, and often it's older people who are joining in as well, by publicly joining together to try and show Parliament that they should change the law in response to this global issue. If you're going to go with type 2 to explain, say, climate change, the focus needs to not be on the domestic pressure. So don't focus on the protest, the petition, or the use of the media, mention it, but focus on the global nature of the issue. That climate change is something that affects everyone. It's something that attracts a lot of international attention, that Australia should respond to this global aspect of it because people are putting on pressure domestically. And this is really closely linked to that idea of representative nature of Parliament. If Parliament doesn't pass laws in line with public interest, doesn't respond to the wishes of the people, then they will be voted out at the next election. Type 1, in terms of international pressures, probably the one you're most likely going to use, and I would say probably the safest one to explain and use in an answer. And this is where this is where we get pressures from external to Australia that put pressure, or external to Australia, because it has to be international, that then put pressure on the Australian government and put pressure on the Victorian government, perhaps, to introduce new laws to Parliament. So this often comes through from global bodies like the United Nations, or other countries putting pressure on, where they try and get us to change the law in response to some kind of domestic issue. And that domestic issue could still be domestic responses, say, to climate change, but also, range of other examples around, application of criminal law, human rights, our treatment of First Nations peoples, laws regarding that, so on and so forth. Often this pressure comes through informal documents like international treaties, and think about the Tasmanian Dams case. If you looked at that, that's an example of international pressure. We sign a treaty to protect World Heritage Areas, so we then need to pass laws in response to that pressure, to that treaty. So international treaties, declarations, or the work of global committees. So it's often coming from that UN level or groups of other countries. And if we don't change the law, our international standing might be compromised. People might think more poorly of us internationally. And this can have a lot of impacts, Poor international standing can impact your ability as a country to trade with other nations. It impacts your ability, or other nations, to cooperate with you on things like military. Trade, obviously a big one, the economy. But it can also impact, things like tourism, if your country is viewed very poorly internationally. That can then again have an ongoing impact on the economy of your country. So it is important that Australia maintains a good international standing, which means often we need to be quite responsive to pressures put on us by bodies like the United Nations. Now, I've got an example questions of both these two types of pressure, like I said. So type 1 versus type 2. And like I said, type 1 of international pressures is that pressure coming from an international organisation or external to Australia. And this is from VCA's set of sample questions they've released for the new study design. And you'll see here, this is a report or a comment from the United Nations Committee on the Rights of a Child, so an international committee. And they've released a report that says all countries should raise the minimum age of criminal responsibility to 14 years. So that was their advice. In Victoria, up until effectively, we're slowly increasing it up to 14 over the next number of years. So it is a change that is going to occur. But in Victoria, prior to effectively last year, or I think even this year when the law started going through, you could be charged with a criminal offence from the age of 10. So this international organisation has suggested 14 years. So there's an external pressure, okay, a global pressure about a domestic issue. So explain one factor affecting the ability of the Victorian Parliament to make law. Here you'd want to talk about external or international pressures. There's pressure external to Australia from an international organisation saying you should do this. This puts pressure on the Victorian Parliament to then change the law in response to the age of criminal responsibility to ensure that we maintain our international reputation. You can talk about maybe some of the impacts of not making that change. Type 2, internal pressures. This was a question from the 2020 exam. And this 2020 exam talked about school strike for climate change and said, hey, here's this talk about the school strike for climate change. You're getting 300,000 people attending rallies across the country, including 100,000 in Melbourne. So domestic pressures, protests are a really big domestic pressure on lawmaking. So representative nature again. But it's domestic pressure about what we would view as a global issue. And again, you want to focus on the idea of what's global about this. Well, climate change is something that affects everyone in the world. It's a global issue that all countries need to respond to so that we can try and save our planet effectively, so that you guys can have a future. Explaining this as a pressure, again, you can highlight the fact that the pressure is coming internally and the pressure is a domestic pressure, but you need to focus on that it is in response to a global issue. So the international pressure is still, even though it's coming from a domestic source, it is still ultimately about an international matter. And that's important if you're asked about the ability of the Australian Parliament, for example, to make law in this area or respond to these protests, or the Victorian Parliament. Our skill here, really importantly, like I've said, is discussion, so an exchange of opinions. So it needs to be that multifaceted, how good is Parliament at changing the law when it gets the opportunity to? How good is Parliament at actually enacting legislative change? And we know that they pretty much always have the ability. They're the supreme lawmaking body, right? So they pretty much always have the ability, but will they actually act on that ability? Do they have the desire to make change? And this is where you could get a couple of different types of questions, I think, theorising here. This straight up one from the 2014 exam, so quite an old exam now, but straight up, discuss the ability of Parliament to change the law. Just, hey, can they, can't they? That's the sort of answer you're going to want to be like, yeah, supreme lawmaking body, but hey, usually they don't really have a will or a desire to, and start talking through all these things that impact their ability to. Or you could get this sort of question that's really specific to one of those three sub-dot points: representative nature, international pressures, or bicameral structure. So discuss how the representative nature affects its ability to make law, read Parliament. So if you got this second type of question, you might be looking at some points like this, Well, the representative nature does affect Parliament's ability to make law because Parliament won't make laws that the public don't agree with. It's a representative government. We live in a representative democracy. People get voted for. Often there's conflicting views about change. So Parliament might be reluctant to make change at all because they're reluctant to try and go against the views of one set of people in the country. However, maybe this isn't an issue. So maybe this doesn't affect Parliament's ability to make law because realistically, Parliaments are elected, which means we should have a Parliament. We should have people with a majority in Parliament who already represent the views of the community. So it's not something that Parliament needs to worry about. It's not something that affects them because they already have that approval from the public by being elected in the first place. So that's something to just consider about that type of question. We could also look at bicameral structure. It really affects Parliament because a political party rarely achieves that majority in both houses. The lower house, again, that's really gets into that representative nature, but the lower house is expected to represent the people, so they're only going to pass laws that the public agree with. But it actually doesn't have that much of an impact, the bicameral structure, because maybe a party could get a majority in both houses. This is a theoretical point you can put forward. You're allowed to do that. You don't have to be like, oh, well, there's not right now, so I can't say that. Theoretically, a party could achieve a majority in both houses, which means it doesn't matter that we have a bicameral structure. It doesn't affect Parliament's ability to make law. Or, if both major parties agree, then we just pass things through anyway. And you'd be surprised to know that I think the number is somewhere between 70 and 80% of legislation in Parliament passes with the approval of both major parties. We never hear about it because it's not good for the media. There's no conflict there. Media loves conflict in politics. So as a result, we don't hear about the fact that most laws just go straight through. So the bicameral structure is not really having an impact at all. Finally, international pressures. Parliament's really likely to respond to international pressures from the international community, because we don't want to risk our international reputation. But what did I say about politicians before? They're doing a job. They're relying on getting voted in again to get their paycheck, to keep their job, what they're earning money for. So who cares if the international community wants something? It's not going to affect Parliament's ability to make laws at all if there's actually a different view domestically. And this is a really, really important one. Parliament is going to avoid anything that could lead to a voter backlash. So the international pressure is not going to have an impact on Parliament, because they're going to be more worried about domestic issues. So Parliament's maybe, for example, not going to act on, a really, say, important one is that comes up in Australia is asylum seekers, or our treatment of refugees, the fact that we send them to offshore detention facilities in places like Nauru, Christmas Island. This is actually against international law. When, according to international law, Australia is not allowed to do that. Domestically, that's something that over a number of years has continued to be a popular political thing to do. So as a result, the international pressure, the international law around asylum seekers actually is having no effect on Parliament's lawmaking, because Parliament's more worried about impressing people domestically. So that's a way that international pressures don't affect Parliament's lawmaking ability. If we were to get a bigger question just around Parliament's ability to make law overall, discuss the ability of Parliament to make law, we might go to some of these bigger picture viewpoints. And this is very much more around Parliament wanting to or not wanting to. So they can or they can't. And these are all the things that will stop Parliament from wanting to change the law. Voter backlash, not wanting to get into controversial areas so that they can avoid vocal minorities talking bad about them. The fact that lawmaking takes a very long time, so Parliament doesn't really want to do it. Parliament has short-term interests because they want to be elected again. They don't really care about maybe the long-term future. But there's also some really important things that do help Parliament change the law, and they are, again, that representative nature, that fear of voter backlash, the fact that Parliament is the supreme lawmaking body, that if needed, Parliament can pass laws quite quickly and can access expert opinion. So we need to be able to respond both to specific questions about how influential these specific factors are, but also need to be able to answer a question on that overall ability of Parliament to change the law and all of the different factors that might influence Parliament in that space. No links today. Again, just looking at the Parliamentary Education Office is a great idea, and something that I would, thoroughly recommend you do if you haven't done it already. But ultimately, if someone comes up to you tomorrow and says, geez, I've been reading about this politics stuff online and I don't really know what's going on. Like, what are they doing in there? They just shout at each other and call each other names and try and get each other with zingers that aren't actually that funny. Like, explain it to me. You can hopefully sit that person down and go, hey, this is what they're up to. This is why they're arguing. This is why they're debating. This is why there's maybe this debate happening in the Senate versus what's happening in the House of Reps. This is what's affecting their ability to make law. This is what's impacting their ability to make a change that maybe you want them to make. Enjoy your studying. Big, meaty dot point, this one. But hopefully that provides a little bit of clarity around what you might need to do with this content, and particularly how you might be assessed on it. As always, open to feedback, but almost holiday time for most people, I would reckon. So enjoy your break.